Greetings, I'm Richard Rhoda, and this interview is part of the Tennessee Board of Regents Oral History Project. It's October 2nd, 2018, and I'm very pleased to be in the company of Mike Krause, who is the Executive Director of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, which we will refer to as THEC from now on, as well as the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation, which will be TSAC. So a very quick introduction of Mike. Our relationship started when Mike was a legislative aide for the state Senate, Tennessee General Assembly, and we were in class together. I was teaching a class at Vanderbilt, and Mike was a student in the program at the time. And based on that relationship, I got to know Mike, and we worked together in his capacity with the legislature. But he then joined the staff of THEC in our academic affairs area. And I'll ask you to put in the dates here. But anyway, was with us for a period of time. He basically was in the right place at the right time to do some things and to handle an initiative of what became a governor's initiative, the Drive to 55, and went to the governor's office. His career brought him back to the Higher Education Commission in 2016, so just a couple of years ago, as executive director. Now that was a whirlwind of your career, Mike, and it didn't do you justice at all, so I'll ask you to fill in the details about that. But I will say something else about Mike, is that right out of high school, he went into the military and served for a period of time and did a number of tours, and I'm sorry, I'll ask you about that, but I guess 8 years in the military, and so we appreciate your service doing that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So let me begin by asking you to clean up what I just said about you and put some more dates and times to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I started off in state government at the legislature as a research analyst for the state Senate in 2007. And to your point, who knew that in 2010 we really were about to take up what'll still be remembered as probably one of the most impactful pieces of legislation to higher education in Tennessee history, the Complete College Tennessee Act. And as it happened, the senator that I worked for, Jim Kyle, was the sponsor of the bill. And so that meant, as a research analyst, a young research analyst, I think I was 26 or 7 at the time, I had a chance to work a serious bill. And that bill also, though, kind of crystallized for me that I wanted to work in higher ed. But I saw the THEC crew walking around, and that struck me at the time. You, the senior team around you, David Wright, the late David Wright, Russ Deaton, and others, I saw that team and thought, I'd like to go pro at some point and do higher ed full time. So was fortunate to be able to join your team at the time in 2010. Worked for 4 years straight as staff there, and in my last year, and it's a great example of Dr. Rhoda, one of your traits is that I try to emulate is you always were very comfortable with pushing your team out. And you were very, I think, willing to give young folks a shot. And for me, that big shot came when the governor's special advisor, Randy Boyd, came to our office. You allowed me to work on several projects with him that I think probably indirectly led to becoming the first Tennessee Promise Director.
I agree.
Which is the position I started in 2014. And did that for 2 years, and then was able to come back to THEC 2 years later as the director.
Right. So what we said earlier in preparation for this, Mike, in a very short period of time, has been involved, well, you said it, 3 very significant milestones: Complete College Tennessee Act, the Drive to 55 and all of its components, and now the Focus Act. So I guess that's what I'd like for us to talk about from your perspective, how it's observations you would make along the way, legislative aspects. So if you just start talking, and we'll see where it goes.
Well, I think that the succession of each of those initiatives show a couple things about Tennessee generally. Tennessee is a state that, if you look among our other southern peers, has always been willing to try some different things. And that goes back in both K-12 and higher education. In 2010, what really was building was a sense in the legislature that higher education, it was maybe time to do something different. And I'll always give you and THEC a lot of credit here, because I actually think the first ideas were governing issues. They were thinking through, well, do we do something higher education structure-wise? And I learned a great lesson then from you and Russ Deaton at the time, because you all had a great idea ready to go, which turned out to not be governance at all. It turned out to be, to paraphrase maybe how you and Dr. Deaton approached it, I think you all said, I hear you on structure, but let's show you something maybe more important. How do we fund colleges? And that was the outcomes-based funding formula, which to this day, as early as last week, we were briefing some people on higher education in Tennessee right now, and that formula, which has now grown into maturity 8 years later, is the foundation. So I really credit THEC and the Board of Regents, both, when the legislature said, we really want to try something big. Remember, too, also, that's 4 years out of the lottery. So the lottery really had only been up and running for one cohort of students. I think the General Assembly and the governor both said, let's keep pushing on higher ed, and THEC and TBR were able to say, if you want to push higher ed, here's what you do. You work on the formula side. So, that formula came into being in 2010. THEC, I think, under your leadership, had really become two things. One, a haven for talent. There was just this incredible group of folks working at THEC at the time, and I hope still are. Many of those people are still at THEC. But the second thing is THEC really had become a think tank, an internal state government idea farm. And that's not true for all the agencies that do THEC's job across the nation, as you know. Many of them are focused on running the trains. THEC was always able to run the trains, but also think about some new tracks. And that's really what happened in 2010. Enter the governor, Governor Haslam, our current governor. In 2011, I'm struck by the conference we all went to at Vanderbilt in January of 2011. And if you'll remember, the message from Governor Haslam at the time was pretty remarkable. He got up and said, everything Governor Bredesen just did, I'm committed to, which I remember all of us kind of breathing a sigh of relief, because we had worked really hard to get a bunch of things in place. And you just never know during a gubernatorial transition what's going to happen. And Governor Haslam came in day one and said, I'm going to support all of that. That then led to, I wouldn't speak on behalf of the governor, but what I know is he started talking to employers. There was a tour in the summer of 2012, you might remember, where he sat down with business and asked them, are you getting what you need from higher education? I think the feedback he got really was about the fact we were just going to need more people with a college degree. And that a lot of the workforce recruitment that had gone on in past decades had been about incentive packages. And what the governor saw wisely at the time is that was changing. That really attracting the next Volkswagen or Nissan to Tennessee was going to be about how many college degrees you had. So I think that was the genesis of the Drive to 55.
Yeah, very much so. And then, well, let's go back, and you mentioned by name Randy Boyd, who, and again, this is something unique. I think, well, I don't remember it happening in Tennessee before, but where a governor brought in this case, a business person, but at least someone not from higher education, to be his eyes and ears and advise him, and special advisor for higher education. But the reason I asked you to do that, Mike, is that your temperament was such of dealing with a high energy entrepreneurial type of Randy Boyd, and really I think making that a very positive experience. And of course really the rest literally is history about the message and the programs that implement that message.
Well, the right word is entrepreneurial. And I also think, and Randy would be the first one to tell you, there were a combination of two events. You had Randy, who, as of very recently, was named the interim president at the University of Tennessee, who is an entrepreneur by nature. And again, you had THEC with some ideas that were ready to be deployed. And I think the combination was, I'll never forget it, we were standing in the THEC boardroom, if you remember it, and there was this big idea, could we make college free? And Randy said, we've done it in Knoxville with Tennessee Achieves. Is there any way we could do it in Tennessee? And you're the one that said, well, you could endow the lottery reserve. And it was one of those moments, I'll never forget it the rest of my career. We're 60,000 students in now with Tennessee Promise, some of whom are helping make this documentary. And that idea came out of that second in time where you said, why couldn't you endow the lottery reserve? And the rest is history. Yeah. We started the program, and you'll remember I got the call that they wanted to operate that out of the governor's office. I moved over to the governor's office We had about 90 days. You remember we did a retreat at Montgomery Bell State Park in June of 14 to figure out how are we in 90 days going to build an application that worked. And I do think historically it's important to remember this was right in the middle of really bad malfunctions on the part of the Affordable Care Act.
Yep.
So if you remember, the Obamacare website had become this news story, and we all saw that as, man, if you're going to build the Tennessee Promise website, better work.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Mike. I had suppressed that, but now
Yeah, that's right.
But now I do remember.
That's right. And we got it up and running. And the other big Tennessee Promise moment that sticks out for me is September 25th of 15. So this is a year later now, and our first students are enrolling. And we went around that day. We did a statewide tour. We flew from Nashville to Johnson City to Chattanooga to Memphis. I think it might have been over 2 days. And when you walked on the campuses for the first semester of Promise, something had changed. And as you know, in higher education, a lot of times it's turning an oil tanker. It's not a speedboat.
Right.
We had lit on to something that happened fast, though. And the data now, it bears out that Tennessee Promise has had a dramatic effect.
Yeah. And you can argue by design that the Board of Regents system, even though it's defined differently now, but really that's where it was targeted. That's where it was.
So, I mean, TBR's role was really important to focus on now for Promise, but also Reconnect, which I assume we'll talk about later. I mean, what I think TBR did really well at that time, one, Dr. Kenyatta Lovett was part of a staff, and it was really his mission to innovate. The 13 community colleges, had always been part of a system since their inception, but I think sometimes the system had varying degrees with which they were willing to say, hey, we're all going to kind of do it like this. And that's a tough discussion to have in higher ed, because colleges are by their nature independent, and that's a good thing. But there's also a tension there, because when you find some interventions that work for students, probably should try to think about a way that every campus deploys them, and Kenyatta Lovett was a big part of that. That first year of Promise, I mean, I'll never forget, we were sitting there having conversations about scripts that were running in Banner. And how to make sure certain things happen for Promise students. And the campuses were just incredibly resourceful, and they were also can-do. I remember the presidents at the time kind of understood, to use an Army term, this was a no failure. Failure was not an option. And we had these, at the first cohort of Promise, we had 19,000 students, all of whom were assuming the money was going to hit their account, and registration process was going to go smoothly. And I think TBR played a really important role, really as a command and control role, but also, and I think this was hopefully part of TBR's original vision, they were an incubator for good ideas.
Yeah.
And when something started working, Dr. Lovett was this connective tissue. So Columbia State, something would work, and he'd be on the phone with the other 12 campuses. Hey, this is working. This is what we need to do. It was a remarkable time, though, just in terms of every day there was a different crisis often, and we just responded. And then, I remember we kind of woke up in October and we had 19,000 kids in college who had registered for classes. They were 8 weeks into school, and, I think we cringed for a while waiting for, some huge shock, and it really never came. I would say a lot to do with because TBR had anticipated the technical issues and addressed them.
Yeah, very good. Well, you mentioned Reconnect, so let's talk about that.
This, in my mind, Reconnect right now, I mean, as we think about the history of TBR, I think Reconnect's going to prove to be TBR's finest hour. So we went through this phase with Promise, we're now 5 years in. Does it matter to say college is free? It does matter. It matters a lot. It helps somebody maybe see their life a little differently. And so I would say circa 2015, we started thinking through, right on the heels of Promise, why couldn't you do this for adults? We costed it out. We looked at the logistics. We also surveyed adults, and TBR was an integral part of that. We sat focus groups in a room of adults and said, hey, what could get you to go to college? And that really became the foundation for what would become Tennessee Reconnect. Important to note for TBR, we tested it first at the technical colleges. We really went live with TCAT Reconnect, as we called it, the same year we went live with Promise. And it had good enrollment. It was not quite as explosive as Promise. And we realized, I think in retrospect, it's because we had put this big asterisk. Adults, you can go to college if it's technical college. Mm-hmm. And you lose people when you do an asterisk like that. So that led to thinking through, okay, how could we just go live, free community college as well for adults? And that was passed in 2016. Our first cohort is now enrolled. We had 32,000 applicants, and absolutely incredibly, now 15,000 of them are on campus.
Wow.
About half of our applicants are on a TBR campus right now. When you talk to adult students, and I have a little bit of insight into this because I was an adult student, you know, it's a big deal to get an adult to decide, I'm going to change my life and go to college. I'm going to divert my entire life to go to college because I think this credential will change my life. And we're poised right now as a state for something very remarkable. The reason I say it's TBR's finest hour, Chancellor Tidings has just been incredible as an anchor to set yet again this tone of no failure. We will figure this out. We will make sure, I think, TBR has one person on every campus that reconnects what they do. Mm-hmm. They think about adult success every day. And I think that's been a really important approach. The data will tell the story, but right now we're very optimistic about how Reconnect will affect our state.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. And like you said, other states will look and for major initiatives to come forward. Again, we can attribute a lot of that to being the fact that the chief executive of the state has made this, it's a state issue, not just a higher education issue. Goes a long way.
One of the more amusing and impressive conversations I ever had with the governor is he started asking me questions about how Banner works. And for those watching that don't know, Banner is the student information system, and I can promise you he's the only governor in America who was talking to me about Banner scripts. It shows he always had the big picture vision. We have to have more Tennesseans with a college degree. We just do. But he also never lost sight of these day-to-day operational details, whether it was bringing in Randy, whether it was ultimately the reorganization that occurred under the Focus Act, the empowerment of THEC. I think the governor just managed to do this really interesting balancing act between big picture and operational. That certainly is, I think, a lot of the reason for our success right now.
Yeah. So good transition now. So the Focus Act of 2016 and what you described as far as the dynamics going on within the Board of Regents and under the leadership of Chancellor Tidings, that was one of the stated, if not the primary, reason for the Focus Act, for the reorganization.
Absolutely.
Take it from there.
Absolutely. I think one of the realizations was that the universities were different entities than they were in 1972. In 1972, many of them, really everyone except for Memphis State, were only a few decades out of being teacher colleges, normal schools. They were, I think they had more in common, just to be frank. And it made sense to have them under the same umbrella as this new governing board, the Tennessee Board of Regents, which became the Tennessee College and University System. And a few things changed over the years. The universities started to get things like medical schools and law schools. They started to get larger. Take a look at MTSU, which in the late 60s and early 70s was very much a commuting teachers college and now has 26,000 students and has research PhD programs. So even as you have all of the universities going their separate directions, you had the community colleges being infused with programs like Promise. And I think the central question was, is the governance structure from 1972 still optimal? Have the universities grown so different and frankly, in some ways more localized, that some local governance wouldn't be a really profound positive change? And then back to the community colleges, this system that had grown to be almost 100,000 students between community colleges and technical colleges, that became its own thing. And what I always say, and what I said at the time when we were running the bill, I wouldn't want to be the person responsible for developing a strategic plan that spanned a medical school at Memphis to TCAT Pulaski. A medical school in ETSU and a law school in Memphis to TCAT Pulaski. That is an incredible mission wingspan. That really was the genesis of the Focus Act. I'd also say it really was much more centered on the community and technical college side than people, I think, understand. That it really had more to do with the evolving mission of the community and technical colleges. And in terms of making sure there's a chancellor who is able to think about Columbia State, Dyersburg State, and Northeast State, who had also grown dramatically and their mission had become focal because of the Drive to 55.
Yeah, so how far into the implementing the Focus Act? Everything's in place.
That's right.
And I'm sure the dust is settling and some things around there. But basically, it's been designed and now it's being implemented. So now we'll let it run its.
We're a year and a half into the new boards being responsible, and I think if you talk to Chancellor Tidings, that means she's about two years into TBR. The name has changed. It's the College System of Tennessee, with responsibility for the 13 community colleges and the 27 technical colleges. And then each of the 6 universities are now known as LGIs, locally governed institutions.
Whose idea was that to call them that?
You know, we struggled with several acronyms, and I can't remember. I think I had a hand in LGI. I think we talked about LGEs, locally governed entities. There were a couple different permutations. I think in the end you're going to be stuck with a government acronym like LGI. But those entities, I think what we've seen over the last year and a half, they've been able to pursue what makes them unique. And TBR has been able to focus. I'm a regent as the THEC director, an ex officio regent. I just came from the last TBR meeting. We were able to have this incredibly in-depth discussion about community college student success. I don't think you could have had that in the old TBR. The mission wouldn't have allowed it, because you needed to also be thinking about medical school accreditation and about Austin Peay's expanding research programs and Tennessee Tech's latest multi-million-dollar grant from the NSA for cybersecurity. Those kinds of conversations lend themselves to overshadowing, I think, some of the important discussions we can have now on community colleges.
Great. So one of the purposes of this oral history project is to capture things that, not dates, not numbers, those are well documented, but to kind of go what was on behind the scene. And you've been great talking about that. But so what was the anatomy of the design and development of the Focus Act?
Yeah.
You were in the governor's office.
I was in the governor's office. I would say in the summer of 2015, we were 1 year under our belt on Promise. So the reality is the genesis of Focus were discussions on what went right and what didn't go so well with Promise. And what we saw with Promise were, of the 13 community colleges, the reality is Tennessee Promise student success was not uniform. And that makes sense in some ways. Colleges are always going to have different levels of success, but this was a wide variance. And me personally, as the Promise director, I became concerned that we would have students who in some ways, this is a strong phrase, but victims of geography, where because I lived in this college's service area, I was going to be offered fewer services than a college that maybe was a little more comprehensive. And I think that opened the door to talk about, could the Board of Regents be that broker of good ideas, which they ultimately became. And to be fair, again, they were doing that under Promise. The reality is, though, we were asking them to still do a lot of other things. Interesting precursor was in the Complete College Tennessee Act, when for the first time we created a community college system under TBR. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the seed on the fertile ground to say, hold on, we've got this community college system under TBR. Could we maybe formalize that? Those discussions in the summer of 15 led to, I think the governor hasn't gotten nearly enough credit for really exhaustively vetting this idea before it was a bill. I can remember multiple lunches with regents and university presidents, multiple conversations at the staff level with the governor where we struggled with, could you get this done? In 1999, Governor Sundquist had ordered a Blue Ribbon Commission on higher education governance. I will fully admit to, I read some of those findings, which many of them were right. In particular, one finding was THEC needs to be further empowered. And that really hadn't happened. I think often in the rest of the THEC team, we kind of had to rely on inferred authorities.
The power of persuasion.
Yes, sir. And the power of convening, which THEC did very well. I think the Focus Act contemplated, could you maybe provide some enumerated powers? So picture the summer of 15 and fall of 15 as idea development. And then anytime you're developing legislation like that, you kind of have the go, no-go meeting. And I think I heard personally from virtually every university, we think there's real opportunity here. And on the part of the community colleges, I think we heard, yeah, that could make a lot of sense. Picture a president's council meeting. In the old days, you would have 13 community college presidents sitting there with 6 university presidents. Who's missing from that? For one, 27 TCAP presidents. For another, if I'm the president of one of the smaller community colleges, I'm sincerely concerned about my ability to have a voice in that room with major research universities. And vice versa, if I'm a major research university president, there's times I'm going to be thinking, this discussion tailored to the 2,000 student community college is probably not the one that's most appropriate for me. So it was pretty remarkable at the end of fall 15, I remember us reviewing the feedback, and it was as unanimous a set of independent findings as you'll ever get. Don't get me wrong, there were always outliers. At that time though, from most stakeholders, we were hearing, wow, this could be a real opportunity. Talk to some national experts. There are, what you learn quickly when you do a national survey on higher education structures is there are 50 ways to do this thing. There is no optimal structure. So that put us back, I think, in really trying to think through what would be optimal for Tennesseans. And in our mind at the time, and in the governor's mind, in my mind, it was community colleges and technical colleges being able to focus on student success, the 6 universities being able to focus on the individual directions they had grown into. Something remarkable that I don't think most people know is we actually did a bit of a fly-around tour to meet with the legislature before the initiative was announced. And as you know, that's rare.
Yeah.
When you're going to announce an initiative like that, typically you've got to rely on dropping the bill, and that's when people learn about it. And I think the governor and others, and I myself, we just had a sense this is huge. This is going to be the first reorg of Tennessee higher education proposed in a bill form since
72 is when the
72.
Regents.
And so I remember it was a Sunday night, we flew up to Johnson City. And it was kind of funny just because I'm not going to say it was cloak and dagger, but the legislators did not know why Bill Haslam was flying in to meet with them on a snowy southern Sunday night.
This is great.
Yeah, yeah. But we did. We flew in, we met them at the airport. And the governor walked in and said, you're here because if I'm going to do this, I need to know you think it's a good idea. And if you don't, let's talk, because we might not do it. But this is an interesting opportunity, not normally afforded, to offer feedback on a proposal. It was interesting. I kept waiting for the meeting where someone said, whoa, hold on. And we really never heard it, with a few exceptions. In the main, the feedback was, this is really promising. And that led to, yet again, something atypical that most people don't remember. We announced the bill in December in a ceremony, a press conference. Again, normally you wait until the bill's filed and you start running through committee. We held a public announcement in the old Supreme Court chamber.
Yeah. And to clarify, so the session didn't start until January.
That's
so
right. This is in December before Christmas, and we are essentially saying this is what we're for. We think the community and technical colleges need a honed focus, and we think that the universities need to be able to pursue things that are really central to their mission. Calling it the Focus Act, I think there was some nice alignment there.
Yeah, so I have a convenient memory, but I do not recall any public pushback. No. Questions maybe?
During the consideration of the bill, yes, Tennessee State University and their stakeholders were certainly concerned. I think that it's an interesting retrospective because we were able to really build a relationship at that time with TSU, because I sat down at the time as sort of the yeoman of the bill, getting it through committee, making sure it was in the correct legal form. We sat down with Dr. Glover, who was an incredible partner. She was just she had some great insight, first and foremost. And she was incredibly collegial to say, there's things about this bill for TSU's purposes we really need to talk about. Yeah. And I give the governor a lot of credit because he was willing to hear it. And the vast majority of the feedback they offered became part of the amendment for the bill that ultimately was passed.
Yeah. So a couple of things, but yes, now that you've corrected my memory, I do remember a picture in the Tennessean of you at the podium, standing room only audience of not too happy faces. So thank you for that memory.
It was one of the more interesting moments. I'd been in legislative committee my entire career, presenting bills for several years. It was a little different to do it surrounded by, at one point, this was great because the TSU student body president ended up becoming my graduate assistant at THEC. And it was funny later, I said, yeah, I was surrounded by protesters, and he said, advocates. And I liked that. I thought that was a great point. Those students were very concerned about things they perceived in the bill that would have had a negative effect on TSU. They were incredibly thoughtful about their opposition. And I think that we got to a place where they weren't opposed. But in the early stages of the discussion of the bill, that's what committee's for.
Yeah, so that's kind of my second point, and kind of taking a step back. So the Regents universities that weren't initially pleased with all this, it was the smaller universities?
You know, the reality was it was mostly a TSU concern. I would say Austin P, if they had a concern, it would be, are we going to be able to build a board of the same stature, of just another university with a larger alumni base? But Dr. Elisa White, who's still their president, I also think saw some inherent opportunity. Those presidents became part of a working group, all of them, where we sat down the day the bill was signed, actually before that, we sat down on the ground floor of the Capitol. We started working through implementation. One, you had to get 48 board members appointed. Two,
Wow.
you had to get those universities standing up on some functions that TBR had been doing for them. And I would say to TBR's great credit, and at the time the interim chancellor was David Gregory, he was part of those discussions too. And what I saw from TBR was very much a spirit of let's get to work. You 6 universities are going to be kind of moving out from under our umbrella. We wish you all the best. We're going to be focused on these 100,000 community and technical college students. And Chancellor Gregory should get a whole lot of historical credit because he had just the right approach. And frankly, he knew everything. And there were some hazards that we uncovered during that time that we were able to address.
Yeah, so not to belabor this, but my sense was the universities, their initial reaction was like, Regents universities, like, whoa, whoa, whoa. It's because they really were deriving some strength by being affiliated or a part of a state system.
Absolutely. I think TSU would tell you, this was a specific point brought up in committee. You know, TBR has been an engine of collaboration for us.
Yep.
It's been a way to keep us all connected. We don't want to lose that. And I thought that was a very thoughtful and wise concern. I'd also say we've got a couple years now, and that hasn't happened. Right. The presidents will actually tell you now they talk more than they did before. I'm not sure why that is, but it is true. But I think that was the kernel behind the concern was we're going to lose something here if we're not part of the statewide system.
Yeah. We have a few more minutes left, and I want to ask you to think ahead. Not a binding conversation, but looking ahead, and talk more about as much about THEC as anything else under this new operation. Yeah. What's the best case scenario? What are some concerns to you?
The best case scenario in all times for THEC is to be seen as a very fair arbiter when it's necessary, a champion of higher education at all times. I think that THEC, one of the things we benefited from your leadership that remains is we constantly seek to be trusted. To be trusted is not to be agreed with. There will be times if THEC's doing our job where we make a determination that an institution doesn't agree with, but they always must trust us. They must trust our motives. They must trust our staff personally, and we seek that very zealously. We try to be seen as a fair and impartial umpire, and to use a baseball analogy, which I know you'll appreciate, we always say we call balls and strikes. And sometimes you're going to throw a strike and we're going to call it. Sometimes you're going to throw a ball and we're going to call it. And sometimes they're going to hit it and and it's going to be right on the foul line. THEC, I think, moving forward has to be seen as just a trusted entity. I think we've got to continue to build on the innovation piece, though. THEC, it'll never be good enough for us to just keep running trains. We'll always have to be thinking, what's next, and trying to incentivize innovation, which we do right now. We have millions of dollars of grants flowing out of our office, and they flow to campuses.
Right. But that truly is amazing, and it's a good, it's not even a problem, but it's a good thing to have. But just think of all the years that it took to build up where funders would look to and want to, for Tennessee to pilot some things.
Well, I always say if you're going to do a Mount Rushmore of THEC, I put your face on there, of course, not just because we're sitting here. I put Brian Nolan's face on there too.
Yep, ETSU president.
The current ETSU president who started off as a THEC, just a jack of all trades if you look at his progression in the agency, because the seeds of this innovation really started with you, I believe, you empowering him to pursue the Gear Up grant.
Yep.
THEC had never been a grantee at that scale. And THEC received a multi-tens of millions of dollar grant from the federal government. And that did two important things. One, it established THEC as a grantor. Two, it got us facing students and in direct service of high school students, trying to get them into college. And what I like to say is now THEC, we're really able to work both sides of the equation. We set the agenda we need more Tennesseans with a degree beyond high school, but we also try to push students into that pipeline via the Gear Up initiative, which has now grown into a permanent state project called Advise Tennessee.
Amazing. Yep. Well, good. Well, Mike, thank you so much. This has been a
absolutely
great conversation.
Really appreciated it.
And yeah, maybe we'll have another session sometime soon, looking further ahead.
I look forward to it.
Great.
Thanks
so much. All right.